Welcome back, everyone. We're back to finally exploring the world of cultures and the levels that actually create cultural systems from underneath the world of matter that we already explored in the first lecture, and the world of life that we just covered in the second lecture, and now as we'll see how the cultural systems are going to evolve or, well, emerge out of this, or how they have evolved. We left off with conflations, which is the world of reinforcements within our bodies and nervous systems in different areas of our bodies, which I called memory regions. And then we built conditionings, which are a specific combination of reinforcements or traits, which create our temperaments. Now, an important thing to point out is that sociality as a phenomenon is primarily observed in animals. It is not something that is observed within the world of, say, trees, at least not in the same way, mainly because animals are able to move and as a result coexist wherever they go around. Now, you can say the same thing about trees. This is why I have not excluded including trees as potentially having certain proto-cultural systems embedded within them, but I'll leave others to explore that branch of cultural systems, if we want to call them that. But most animals are actually independent, and they're non-social, like turtles. They'll just fly off, and the only social time is during mating season. Now, throughout generations, different species of animals added different layers of evolution and in terms of social behavior. So instead of only wanting to meet and be social during mating season, which for many animals doesn't last long at all, it expanded into the domain of surviving better if they stick around each other, if they stick around to help raise children, and all the way up to where it's not just a social network of direct parents, but rather a social network where there could be even grandparenting and generational parenting. So these are all different layers of genetic traits that different animals have adopted in order to establish an environment where they can be consistently social and consistently want to maintain that social group. So again, just like cellular systems and creation of living system need to know how to stay within their membrane. Any cultural or any animal group that has social inclinations will want to maintain that world. Okay, now we're going to build toward that, and we're going to start with the routines that our conflations do. Before we go on, I need to make a very clear distinction between the world of conflations and routines in the way how we can and need to learn to understand both worlds as independent, separate entities. And I describe that through this. Okay, so how do we know whether something, say, if I want to reach a glass of water and lift it up, there's going to be a range of neural circuits that are going to get invoked in order for me to lift that glass that are independent from one another. And those would be the different neural regions that are lined up in order to create the entire movement of me drinking a glass of water. Now, that act of drinking the glass of water can be defined as a separate entity, independent entity. And one thing that we have to learn to do at this point is to look at the rate of expression of different emergent systems. We're at the point where we're in real time right now. And let me explain what I mean by that. When we're in the world of matter, everything happens really quickly. The world of elementary particles all the way to molecules, pretty much, are instantaneous as far as we're concerned. The rate of their expression, and especially consistent expression, is so fast that it's incomprehensible even with some of the highest technological advancements that we have. Molecular networks are sort of 1,000th of a second fast. So something just zips around. Like, it can be observable. We can technically film it. But molecular networks, in terms of how quickly, say, proteins get expressed, or genes get expressed into proteins, and those processes, they zip around really quickly. But they're getting close to our real time. Cellular networks are kind of similar because they're also molecular networks, whereas memory regions now get into the real-time world because they create our conditionings and routines consequently. And when you feel something and when you move your hand, that's all in the domain of the real time. Once we start building into the higher domains of our tree of culture, we have to start thinking of entities by slowing the time down rather than speeding it up with understanding how molecular networks work. We have to slow it down in order to understand how routine works. So in order to understand a routine of drinking the water, we don't look at the process of drinking water. We look how many times in a day I lift the glass to drink water. And as a result result, that's defined as like if you were to look at, one day in 1 second, and every instance within my body that lifts the glass would be a consistent reformation, and depending on how thirsty I am, it would express of how regularly I invoked the routine of drinking water. Okay. And when it comes to sociality and cultures, it's how regularly we invoke the domains that are cultural and specific for the culture of the society that we live in, that are nurtured into us. And that's where we're going right now. So routines are neural cascades, as I define them. We'll be exploring them in detail right now. And they can be either socio-cultural or non-socio-cultural. Socio-culture is, by definition, a cultural phenomenon, because one can be social but not necessarily have cultural replication that happens within it. Within the world of routines is how a specific animal behaves and how the conditionings that it built up in its domain of conflations are lining up in order to create a specific habituated routine. So for example, like an animal will wake up and then go feed at wherever it feeds at. It will get different needs met in different orders by lining up different firings of different conflations in order. Those are routines. So any routine is how an animal behaves in any given moment. Now, some of those routines are interactive, right? Most of them are just movements, rest, protection, repair of oneself. Some of them are interactive, meaning that they're not necessarily social in the way where they evolve together, but they just interact with specific other animals that are around them. But some of them cross into social observational learnings. When the domains of neural circuitry that want to stay interactive within a social experience, that's when it becomes social, where it starts reinforcing itself. And it's not just in the name of walking away, but rather within staying social. Now, just because animals are social doesn't mean that they're necessarily cultural, or that the behaviors that are displayed are preserved in the way how they shape the societies throughout generations. So it's very similar that it is sociality, or the animals wanting to stay within the social sphere and run their routines around each other and influence each other, just like molecular networks were creating back in the day. So just like routines are creating specific feedback cycles that create social environments that produce cultures, similarly molecular networks in the past, during primordial soup days, were creating driver reactions by interacting organic molecules with each other, or potentially builders of living systems, which eventually drove life. So similarly, sociality is to cultural systems what driver reactions and organic reactions would have been to life. So interaction and sociality and organic and driver reactions are isomorphic in their functionality when it comes to creating of the next level emergent systems. So an example of a routine would be, for example, something that you learn for the very first time, and then something that it's going to trigger another conditioning that you learned from before, and all of these are going to be run by the middle, different conditionings that we've learned throughout our whole life. And then that's going to create a cascade of different things that we can observe. I just wanted to show that diagram really quickly. Now, we're in the world of cultures. We're stepping into the world of cultures. Even though this domain doesn't include it yet, this is that crossover here that I've outlined before, where this emergent system actually functions in the world of socio-cultural groups, okay? So we're going to explore that right now. The most important thing I want to define right now is the distinction between a routine and a strategy. Again, they're technically the same thing, but I'm consciously locking in the definitions. A routine is something that anyone can learn. You can go climb a mountain and learn your own routine of how you meander through the mountain that nobody ever showed you. If the routine that you create, for example, you decide to make a map and then tell other people where to go and how to climb that mountain, or if somebody already did it before, that routine automatically becomes classified as a strategy. So routines are strategies, but I have defined a strategy to specifically be a cultural phenomenon, which is something that somebody already figured out, as we already said, something that is getting engaged rather than learned for the very first time. Okay, so it's a saved engagement. And I would like to explore a few specific domains of routines that are only exist within cultural systems. So they're listed here, but I'm gonna put them in a list here and add one more, because of course there's many of them. The first one is the habituated strategies of societal functionality. So habituated strategies means that they're already habituated, they're happening regularly. Like you can have a book of how someone should behave, but nobody applies it. So it has to be habituated in animals, and it has to have societal functionality. So it can't be something that you do on your own within society. The society has to be involved in replicating that knowledge. And I do want to point out yet again, before I forget, that the world of genes and proteins in this domain here act very similar in the way that, and you'll see they're placed very similarly above the line, just like genes and proteins are placed here. The world of, as I define them, cultural norms and memes are the ideas that are within a society that everybody knows, just like genes are saved as codes of how the cell is to be built, and then our output, which is our bidding into the society, is our proteins, our behaviors are technically and emotions and all that, all those conditionings built out of those. They're acting as technically proteins, societal proteins that are going out there and building the society that we live in. And I think it's really important to point that out to understand the feedback cycle of these habituated strategies and how they're enforced. And then, of course, there's the imitation, meme to bid expression, judgments, operant condition, and meme to bit expression, regulation, and governance, which is technically your governance of your society. Let's look through all of them really quickly. Habituated strategies of societal functionality. A simple example would be traffic is an excellent example of how society functions, because everyone agrees to very simple rules to follow, and everybody knows the rules. And as much as that there is entities like police that enforce them, people already know. So these are not new learnings. This is what we knew of how to behave, and we have to go through different levels of schooling in order to be able to exist within the traffic system. And a good habituated strategy would be that when people walk into a car and they sit in a seat, the experience that they're in a car, their automatic reaction and habituated strategy for that social circumstance is in order to put everyone into a safe zone culturally. An animal wouldn't think of that unless it was pre-thought and pre-learned and pre-planned to actually put the seatbelt on. So that would be a habituated strategy. Then the act of imitating something, which is meme to bit expression, just like there's gene to protein expression in biological systems. My direct analogy, isomorphic analogy, is that imitation is the act of having an idea what should be done, and then your brain creating the process of executing that. Okay, so you can observe somebody do something, or in the past have observed and retain the memory, and then be able to connect that circuitry to the circuitry of you moving your hand or doing a specific act that would mimic what you have observed. That mirror neuron area in the brain is, in my analogy, technically what the ribosome is. It's the bridge between, ribosome is the bridge between the genetic world and the protein world, which is nucleotides to amino acids, whereas the act of imitating through mirror neurons serve as the bridge of translating our experiences and our built-up knowledge into an actual domain of efferent domain of creating behaviors in the world. One thing that's important to point out about imitation within human societies, I want to explore two things within it right now, and one of it is that imitation, to bring in back the conditioning, because it's the conditioning that's being imitated ultimately, and that is that we can imitate in three different ways. We're imitating motion strictly, and every child is very used to, if you observe babies, they very early on develop the process to move the exact same limb as you and do facial features, which is when the pathos starts coming, which is the imitation through empathic systems, if you want to call them. Through empathy, you are able to imitate how the other person feels. This is why technically you can say that you know how the other person feels, because you are invoking the same emotion in you. So it's just as much your hand is not the other person's hand and you're imitating the hand. Your feeling's not the other person's feeling, but it's technically or essentially, and technically one could claim literally, even though it's subjective, in its expression at least looks the same. Empathy would be an imitated visceral world. And then finally, another imitation that we have is the imitation of the linguistic system, where we can actually assign a symbol, and that's in this domain. And that's what I call the logos. Logos is the word. whether it's the sound, whether it's a specific word, whether it's even a movement, if it's symbolism involved, that's what makes it logos. And that is what I would, in one big umbrella term, call language. So we've got motion imitation, we've got emotional empathy, and we've got symbolic language, which are three ways to create a replicated entity of some sort within a social system, creating culture. So that would be imitation. Then we've got judgments. That's another domain of routines, or better to say, routines that create cultural systems and strategies. And the routine is such that if you experience that somebody is not, in this case, seeing someone not putting their seatbelt on, you actually prompt them to put, you say something. You actually say that them not wearing a seatbelt is wrong. Okay? Because a judgment at its core is how your conditioning swings. This is, again, in my comparison, is that whether the protein is going to be expressed in this or that way, depending on how genetically it's being pushed underneath. Because sometimes when the car is not, when it's in still motion, when it's parked, you don't have to have your seatbelt on. But if it's moving, you have to. So it's all conditional and expressed epimemetically in a way. Whereas if there's certain thing happening in the living system, something will be methylated, and then you would know when it would get invoked. Similarly here, you know that at some point that judgment call of what's right and wrong, and this is where what's true and not true and what's right and wrong completely departs, and is the essence of what cultural systems are and how they should not be mixed up with rationality of empirical facts and data, because being right and wrong in this context means whether you're invoking the act of judging a situation based on your pre-learned bag of, well, knowledges that are applicable to the specific society that you come from. So that would be the judgment. Now, the most fascinating part is that what I call epimemetics. That's the memetic expression. And it's very similar, ironically, to how epigenetics function, because you can have a methyl group or a methyl group-like molecule, which are in the world of monomers yet again. Functional groups and monomers as defined molecules, as we saw them earlier. Those molecules can, depending on how they're attached, either prevent something from happening or they will encourage something to happen. And that's the world of operant conditioning. Operant conditioning uses judgment through rewards and punishments. And notice that rewards and punishments are just different ways, whether you're putting the punishment on to achieve a specific result, or whether you're withdrawing the reward to create a specific outcome, and vice versa, whether you're rewarding to encourage a behavior or whether you're withholding punishment in order to encourage the behavior. So the conditioning type number one is when you want to increase the behavior. A good example would be that when someone walks into the car, to just politely ask them to put their seatbelt on, and then if they do, you know, thank them nicely, or, you know, if you want to really pull off a Pavlov, then you can just throw the treat their way. Another conditioning type is how to decrease the behavior that we don't want. In this case, if the same scenario happened and the person didn't put the seatbelt on, the driver could make a big deal or force them in some way, or not want to drive, or, you know, do some kind of a operant conditioning process, which is, again, another kind of routine that we exert in our social sphere in order to achieve a certain outcome. In this case, an outcome to reinforce the cultural memes that are expected within the society of that has traffic in it, that likes the idea of putting seat belts on. And again, like, there's some really dangerous, like, for example, engineering sites where people work in the mountains where putting a seatbelt on is actually illegal. In case you roll over, you might need to jump out of the car. So the societal, cultural standards, how to create the order, is very context dependent. And of course, in a large city full of people where there's a lot of pedestrians and cars, it's essential to follow the laws of traffic. Now, what humans are extremely good at, which is really amazing, is we're able, well, some other species as well, it's a matter of researching this, of course, is we have theory of mind capabilities, which is what I think you should think, especially when it's implemented in that operant conditioning way, which is what judgment really is. So the idea of telling somebody what to do and judging them is quite literally, in some way, the opposite process of what imitation is. And that's where the more modes of persuasion come in, and they exist in the domains of ethos, pathos, and logos, except that they are influencing you. So being assertive or dominant, for that matter, would be a matter of implementing what the social norm is rather than just simply imitating it. The most powerful part of it is that when a human society is congruent with or has a very, let's call it healthy, feedback loop between imitating and reinforcing back onto the person, that really locks in the cultural systems to such high degrees that humans have pulled off, where in so many infinite domains we have created cultural artifacts that are extremely well replicated, be it piano pieces or musical compositions or art pieces or specific sports or businesses. The entire world of AI is the fourth emergent world that I am yet to explore. Maybe in the next manuscript I can talk the fourth emergence underneath the first three that we explored. And that's why I like to call these systems the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Because the Father, you can do Mother, Daughter, and the Holy Spirit. The bottom line is that there's the Maker underneath. There's the Son, Daughter that comes out of that, and the Spirit is the culture, which is, as much as life can be observed, cultural systems, especially because they function on a slower rate of expression or emergence and not easily is observable, they feel like they're a spirit within us. They just operate in a different way over us. What's interesting is that out of the forces of culture, now we have a fourth emergent field, which is the world of artificial intelligence, which is really the world of logos. A formula that's written down is already artificial intelligence, telling us that, when two numbers are multiplied, we'll get another number. That is us artificially calculating something. And we have just managed to outsource it into, inanimate world to help us and aid us like technology, just like we did with technology. And this brings us now to socio-cultural groups. Now, just like, again, back to this picture, just like we had molecular networks here that were technically the same thing as cells, except cells were self-maintaining within the membrane. Similarly, we can say that routines, just like molecular networks are just networks that can happen without the context of a cellular system. Similarly, routines is something that any animal or people can do at any point. It's once they start becoming wrapped into a specific social group is when they start becoming considered cultural routines, strategies, and they create socio-cultural groups. They harness and protect routines, making them strategies. That's the point. Now, what kind of different societies do we have? All right, there are two types of societies. One is the one that predominantly functions as autonomous, egalitarian, or non-nesting group. I'm going to explain each one of those. So, and then there's the second one, which is the hierarchical, and we're all aware of that. So, egalitarian or autonomous group would be a group of friends where, when they want to do something together, they kind of all negotiate directly with each other. This is one of the elements of egalitarian society, is that you have to actually be able to stand on your own feet. You have to have a strong dose of masculinity, as defined before, of temperaments built into you, where you have to be able to fend for yourself. At the same time, it's everyone's equal technically, which is almost counterintuitive in the way of, if everyone's equal, one wouldn't need to stand for oneself. But it's precisely because everyone's considered being equal, one has to own up in their own way to negotiate directly with everyone else, because there's no other higher entity explaining or saying what one should or shouldn't do. Whereas in the hierarchical societies, there's a specific smaller subgroup. Now notice again an emergence of a smaller subgroup. It could be one person, it could be extra people who have a certain amount of memes, or I like to call memes what one should do. That's another definition of a meme. I might have not defined it yet. I've defined before, but the meme is also to be thought of what one should do within society. If one just feels like doing something, then it's not meme and it's not cultural. That means that you're just letting your nature take over and you're just behaving how you want. If you need to stand in line or sit in a certain way when you're having dinner or whatever it is that you have to abide by some bon ton out there, the question is whether it's coming from the specific amount of those behaviors are actually being, to a large degree, coordinated and governed by a smaller group within the tribe, if you want to call it. So they'll make decisions of what everyone should do. In times of drought, somebody says, well, we have to do this, we have to do that, and it's decided for everybody. One important thing that I want to point out, again, bringing us to this this comparison chart that I have here. And that is that just like prokaryotic cells don't have a nucleus, similarly, egalitarian autonomous societies don't have a governing body within them. And what's really strikingly interesting to me is that just like non-nuclei prokaryotic cells, they never build multicellular organisms. Only cells that have nuclei are able to bring multicellular organisms. Similarly, autonomous groups, small tribes, they don't build larger multi-level societies like nations and towns. It's only the smaller groups that have within them a hierarchical structure with a sort of like a nucleus of governance are able to group up into larger societies. That's super important to notice because that nucleus is essential in order to coordinate the different, in this case, cells, to be able to build multicellular networks. Similarly, one needs to have, the cook in the kitchen to talk to other cooks in order to create, the cook society, that will now coordinate all the societies. And it's interesting how similar it is. The basic unit of any sociocultural group is the family unit in humans. Then they build into tribes, which is multiple families. Then it can build into community, which is technically the similar thing as a tribe, except community now exists in the context of larger, if you want to call them, colonies of societies, just like in bacterial worlds we would have called them. Now it's the point at which certain societies get differentiated. So you have to have a bakery, and you have to have, just like an organism would have to have, the spleen and the heart and all this. Similar to society, the larger it becomes, the different social groups that belong in it would get stratified or differentiated. Those two words can interchangeably be used both in living systems, cellular systems, as well as sociocultural group settings. Okay, and that would be your stratified groups that create multicellular organisms, just like they have their differentiated cells. And some examples would be hospitals, schools. I can go on and on with this one. Okay, so here's some examples. Here we have an egalitarian group where everybody coordinates with everyone else without anyone specifically in charge of anything. And of course, in a hierarchical society, we can clearly see that there's a top-down, and whether this is one person or a family or like a larger group of people that are to some degree influencing the rest of the individuals into specific behaviors, makes it a hierarchical system. And again, remember, these are the temperaments that we're all born with. We have, as Sapolsky always pointed out, we have both domains in us, humans in this case. We have the egalitarian one, which is fending for ourselves, which is every animal, because we all evolved from being independent and just being born into this world. And then sociality emerged slowly, where we learned to now negotiate with others. So that negotiation was there with the world all the time. The hierarchical one is a more newer development within societal systems. Just like the nucleus in prokaryotic into eukaryotic cells was developed, similarly governments came in as a genetic trait and temperament. So it's something that we fully understand, both of these systems, and we can exist in both of those equally well. But we have to be aware of which one's operating in which society in order to know how to function with it, of course. And some people like these systems better, some people like this. Again, depends on your temperaments and how you were conditioned as well, right? So nature and nurture right then. So a company office they would have specific definitions. A company would have a CEO, managers underneath, and then the staff underneath. Restaurant would have a manager. They got the chefs. Chefs are in charge of the rest of the staff. A ship, similarly, captain. It's always the same formula, okay? And so on. Now, let's look at societal stratums. We're on level 11 now. There's just one more level to go before we look at all how big cultural systems are able to become in their building. And notice also something, because the world of sociocultural groups is the world of rules and laws. Because a meme is what one should do, is really setting the rules. And in certain very important, again, it's a gradual thing of how important something is. It's always gradual, because it's all governed by how emotionally we're going to get conditioned into our conditionings, as defined before. And the stronger the emotion, the more it becomes a law, which can be implemented into the books of society, if the society has books to keep track of. So essentially, laws within human societies are pre-created in order to create and maintain the balance or order of society. For me, a homeostasis of a living organism is equivalent functionally to the order within a society. So people need to abide by the laws of the society in order to exist within it. And if they don't abide by it, then the society will respond accordingly, as it always does, depending on which societies, of course. In this case, I aimed towards building of cultural systems, but if we were just to define life as it is, cells go in the direction of multicellular organisms in order to define the tree of life. In order to define the tree of cultures, as I'm finding out in this process, I'm similarly defining socio-cultural groups to develop into multi-level structures, which is technically kind of like multicellular organisms, except that I chose to use the word stratum mainly because it's a bit of a clumsy word, but it works very well for this, because before we define the next level of multi-level societies, we have to acknowledge that there are specific stratified subgroups that can do the same function. So, for example, there's breeding bands, bachelor bands. This is a good time to bring up some examples. So, breeding bands, bachelor bands. Okay. This is a multi-level society of elephants, and these are the different stratums that are in them. So these are going to be different family stratums. So different family units can exist within the clan of the elephant. But of course, there's another stratum of individual lone males that actually are technically not within this society, but come in and socialize. Even if they socialize a little bit, you have to remember, when you speed up this process, you can see the males coming in and out or interacting with the females in certain ways, which makes them part of the emergent system and making it a significantly statistically important detail in the existence of that society. Okay, but all of these worlds are to be recognized as independent and separate stratums. I had a picture also of a shopping mall in my original manuscript where I showed the different stores where they all coexist within the context of a larger shopping mall. And then small groups of friends are the egalitarian little bacteria that come in and out and buy stuff, whereas most of the stores are actually governed by the managers of those stores, which is a hierarchical entity. Similarly here, they did some research on snub-nosed monkeys. This was fascinating to find because they have different stratums, which is when the male, the alpha male, is in a specific family group with offspring, there's only one male, whereas there's bachelor bands that are swimming around, very similar in some ways to the way elephants work. Just shows how similar animals really are. But the entire colony, or it's not even a colony because they depend on each other. Like, you can almost think of this as a backup, that if anything happens to the male in the main family, there's available bachelors who will jump in and maintain that society, which makes it a very stable system. So it's very important to recognize that this thing is not just independent. They are actually, to some degree, genetically even stratified into a specific behavioral niche that exists in a specific stratum of that society. Super important to point out that. And then here's an example of societal strata within a human society. So you have different services and coalitions that exist either hierarchically or there's smaller groups within them, and they all interact with each other and with the different businesses and offices, and this creates this is just a very rough, kind of like imaginative picture of it, but essentially it would show different strata of a different society that is larger. So, and those can be governing bodies, those can be healthcare institutions, zoom in on that. There can be human educational systems, there can be militia, it can be armies, agriculture, religious institutions, scientific institutions. So all of these are different strata. They're all different strata of multi-level human societies. And that brings me to the last page, which outlines the multi-level societies below here that are built out of societal stratums. And again, you can almost think of sociocultural groups as being cells, societal stratums as being tissues of society, and then multi-level societies actually being the multicellular versions of societies. And that's why you have elephant clans, as we saw, cetacean, palads, primates, human chiefdoms, human modern state societies. And notice that I purposely separate human chiefdom, which is a tribal structure, from a modern human society. They're two different worlds. as far as classification is concerned. Even though we're of the same species, doesn't necessarily mean that we have the same type of societal order within the societies that we belong to. And one really important way to understand of how good humans are with creating really multi-level societies, and I made a diagram of a multi-level society. It always starts from the individuals at the very bottom, right? And then they have their families or whatever groups they belong to around each other that have their own first level societal rules. So that can be family, school, workplace, right? That's where at a certain day you might find yourself either one or the other. But you as an individual are actively involved in creating those societies, even if it's 9 to 5 domain. That means it's like taking a breath, right? At this point, there's oxygen. At this point, there isn't. Similarly, the city can fill up with workers in a day, and it will fill out right after into the evening. It's almost like a breath of society can be understood through when the actual people within society, for example, sleep, and then when they're active, that will be the breath, and then slow. So and you notice again that everything slows down. Like routines started from being real time, because conflations and routines are pretty much real time. But the more we go into socio-cultural groups, this is why legislation and laws take a long time. You have to wait until a certain date in order for your court hearing, or certain things take time to be implemented societally because you have to make sure that you process it. And everything becomes slower, so it has to be sped up. And the more you build up the tree of emergence, the slower things get. So the time in the way of expression is slowing down as we climb up this tree. Okay? So from here we have these specific groups of families, businesses, grouped within a municipal. This is your neighborhood, if you will, a certain area of the town where you can call it an entity. Then certain municipalities then gather together and create an actual city, right? And then in a certain area. And notice this is all because our neurons are embodied within our bodies, and humans actually settle. Even though, notice now, when it comes to multi-level societies, you have to be embedded. Just like a large multicellular animal organism, the cells are kind of locked into the animal. Similarly, cities are locked in. And just like bacteria passes through animal bodies, similarly, a circus can come to a town, as I was mentioning, or travelers can go, or people can travel to different places. So there's a lot of stuff moving through the city, but the city as an entity remains. And it's really important to notice that everybody plays the role that they have to play, regardless how they feel like it, in order to maintain the society. And just like a body in I don't know how many days or years doesn't have a single atom the same that's running the body, similarly, if you look, in 200 years, a same society that is functioning in the same way, or more or less the same way, if it doesn't have too many mutations to change its course, would be comprised of completely different set of people who have come and gone. So this is where it's the system that's running the machinery itself, and the individuals are really just merely playing the roles. So that you can have a territory, like a province, an entire area that can be pronounced a province or a state, that can share. And notice that they can share rules and laws of certain percentage, if you will. There's a subgroup of laws. So within your family and your group, you have your rules and laws of how you behave at home or at the office. Then the municipal will have rules around how you should take the garbage out, or how you should behave on the traffic. Traffic is actually in the world of municipality. And then once the provinces come in, then they start dealing with how to make laws and rules about certain behaviors that appeal to the overall belief system of that entire area. And it can go as far as making it federal in a way where these lands they can cover a big part of the globe. And I think we're at the preface right now because of the development of technology and internet, where global entities, there's initiatives to create rules and laws that will create basically cookie-cutter solutions for the entire globe. So this is how a multi-level society would function, where this is the arrows that point down here, would function only here. But these arrows here function on this area. And these arrows, for example, would function on these, if that was the federal area, right? And so on. And humans are very good with creating this and understanding them and following them and moving between and being able to fully adapt to any of the positions and roles. Of course, if you're qualified and, belong to the stratified group in the way of your education being adapted to it. All right, we've done it. So in a nutshell, we needed to have 9 levels of emergence in our universe, on planet Earth here, in order for there to be a possibility for cultural systems to start evolving. And they evolved, and they carry their own set of forces with them. What's really struck me is that each one of these levels have unique forces within them that are driven by the entities created within these levels. And it's really important to recognize that a societal force, which is what the book is about, Forces of Society, what the project is about, is to identify forces of society as opposed to forces of life, as opposed to forces of matter. Matter is just innate, life is nature, and culture is nurture. And they all work together to create our world and us. Thank you for listening and being part of this journey.